Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Daniel here with another book review. Today we are looking at Firestorm, Bombing of Dresden, 1945. So today's book is Firestorm, The Bombing of Dresden, 1945. It is an edited work by Paul Addison and Jeremy A. Crang. It was published by Pimla Kerr. It was published back in 2006. As far as I'm aware, it was only available in paperback. I'm just guessing based on this first page here because it doesn't say that it's reprint or that it doesn't make specific reference to this being a paperback edition. But just to read the blurb on the back, it says, on the night of the 13th to 14th of February 1945, the RAF bombed the city of Dresden, causing devastating fires which obliterate the historic city centre and killed many thousands of people. 60 years later, these raids remain one of the most notorious and also one of the most controversial episodes in the history of the Second World War. Firestorm, The Bombing of Dresden, 1945, assembles a cast of distinguished scholars, including Sebastian Cox, David Bloxham, Tammy Davis-Biddle, Nicola Lambourne, Sonka Nielsen, Richard Overy, and Hugh Strachan, to review the origins, conduct, and consequences of the raids. Each contributor writes from his or her own perspective, offering the reader a panoramic assessment of the evidence and the issues, including the question of whether or not the bombing of the city constitutes a war crime. Firestorm conveniently demonstrates the reasons why Dresden has come to symbolize the military and ethical questions involved in the waging of total war. So, for me personally, I think this is probably one of the best, if not the best book on Dresden. I mean, it is 260 pages all in, of which 219 are actual text. Text itself is pretty legible. It's a nice size, not too big, not too small. But yeah, as I say, for me, it's one of the best works on Dresden, and I think that's probably going to be pretty controversial. In as much as there are some fantastic works out there on strategic bombing, the bombing of Dresden, notably Frederick Taylor, his work on Dresden, which is a phenomenal book in itself, running at 500, 600 pages in length. But what I like about this book is the way it's broken down. There is a number of contributors to it, as was referenced by the blurb: Sebastian Cox, Hugh Strachan, Jeremy Crang, Tammy Davis-Biddle, Richard Overy, and they're all looking at different aspects of the war. So there's the strategic bombing and the question of civilian casualties up to 1945, why Dresden was bombed. There's a chapter dedicated to the city under attack. There's Tammy Davis-Biddle writes about the wartime reactions. Richard Overy discusses the post-war debate. Nicola Lambourne discusses the reconstruction of the city and should it have been reconstructed as sort of Dresden was in 1945, or sort of in a what would have been at the time a more modern way. Alan Russell looks at why Dresden matters, and Donald Bloxham looks at Dresden as a war crime. Now, what I like about this is that sort of each contributor comes from a different perspective. You know, some are British, some are American. I have to admit, I don't know where Sam Nielsen's from. I'm guessing possibly Germany just by the name, but his or her work is not one I've personally came across before. But you know, if you've came across their work, please let me know. Let me know what your thoughts are. That'd be great. I have to do a little bit of research myself on that one. But each contributor comes sort of, they're all specialists in that field. I mean, Richard Overy, for example, is a renowned historian. Tammy Davis-Biddle, hugely respected when it comes to air power and bombing. So everyone seems to focus on their own speciality, and sort of it's quite niche what they're all looking at in this book, and that allows them to sort of go into detail but not get lost in the argument, because each chapter is probably the length of a journal article. It's 30 pages or so, not particularly laborious, but this book doesn't really pull any punches in that it's rather focused, because each contributor's got a specific task to look at. Whereas, like Frederick Taylor, there's a couple of chapters dedicated to what was in Dresden industry-wise prior to the bombing. Then there's the chapters dedicated to the raid itself, the bomb loads, getting the bombers ready to flight out, the actual raid, and coming back, and then a whole host of chapters on the aftermath. Whereas this sort of glosses over that to a degree, in that it's very pointed. It's looking at that from a specific standpoint. It's more targeted. It's not there to look at every aspect and to consider what ifs and all that. It's very much a sort of revisionist, but the evidence that each contributor uses is well within its time. For example, Tammy Davis Biddle writes the standard chapter in this, looking at the wartime reactions. So most commentaries of Dresden, in my mind, seem to focus on sort of the raid and calling it a war crime, and there's the whole question over how many people were killed. It started with Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels saying that there was 100,000 killed, which was taken up by David Irving, which for years led everyone to believe that 100,000 people were killed. They tend to focus on sort of the British archbishops, who were very much against strategic bombing. Archbishop Bell's one who springs to mind, and sort of the whole debate that started about should Dresden have been bombed, Churchill distancing himself from it. Whereas this book doesn't go into all of that to a degree. What it looks at is it looks at the briefing afterwards and how the Allies sort of were very much just treating Dresden as any other raid. I mean, it has to be remembered that when Dresden was bombed in February 1945, it came after the raids on Lubeck, Rostock, Hamburg, where they'd all been Firestorm raids. There'll have been countless others that I can't immediately think of, but it shows that Dresden wasn't an isolated event, and I think what tends to get lost in other works on Dresden is that it wasn't isolated, and that it wasn't sort of a case of Dresden was bombed and everyone sort of thought, oh, strategic bombing is bad, we shouldn't do it anymore. We need to think about the post-war situation and what we're actually fighting for in our legacy here. More case of, Dresden was bombed by the RAF, and then the next morning the US Army Air Force showed up and bombed the smoke. A week later, or 10 days after Dresden was bombed, Pforzheim was obliterated by 700 RAF bombers. Following Pforzheim was Würzburg, where I think approximately 90% of the old town was obliterated, which was a higher proportion than Dresden. So all that gets overlooked, and the fact that it was only in March 1945 that sort of Churchill's infamous memorandum questioning strategic bombing and whether or not it should be stopped was actually written and released. And yes, he singles out Dresden because by that point Dresden had become sort of a focal point. But for me, I think that's sort of putting too much of an emphasis on Dresden. I mean, Dresden has come to symbolise the strategic bombing campaign and moral questions that knew of it, whereas, it's a whole debate that you can go into as to whether or not the Allies should conduct a strategic bombing campaign. And I think what has to be borne in mind when looking at Dresden, which is one thing that this book does rather well, is that on the 13th of February 1945, when Dresden was bombed, no one was sure when the Second World War was going to end. Everyone gets hung up on the casualty figures, which is something that we'll look at in another video, which, modern estimates put it somewhere between 18,000 and 25,000, which is far lower than the 100,000 which was thought at the time. And everyone, with the benefit of hindsight, says, well, Dresden shouldn't have been bombed because it was so close to the end of the war, and everyone was fleeing the Russians and passing through Dresden. But it's overlooked that the Soviets asked for a number of cities to be bombed, and Dresden was the unfortunate target that was chosen by the Allies. In February 1945, there was no cast iron guarantee that the war was going to end anytime soon. Anyone who's seen various different programs about Germany's wonder weapons and secret weapons, Germany was planning on fighting until 1946 if it could, hoping that jets like the Focke-Wulf Tu-183, for example, would go into production, would turn the tide, or various other wonder weapons like the Glocker would manage to get off the ground and turn the tide, or whatever else. January had seen the end of the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last great offensive in the West. So Germany still had plenty of fight in it. The Allies at the time were looking to cross the Rhine River. So there was no cast iron guarantee the war would have ended. And arms of the SS were fighting right up until the end. There was thought about the Alpine redoubt that the Germans would go and sort of hide out in the Alps, and the war would continue on. It would be a great slogging match. So from that perspective, personally, I can understand why Dresden was bombed, and that's something that comes across really well in this book. It doesn't really pull any punches. As I say, it's not the thickest book in the world, but it gets its arguments across rather well. It's a very easy read, it's an enjoyable read, it's very informative, and it does sort of cause you to ask a lot of questions, and sort of it makes you think that what you perhaps knew or thought you knew is not necessarily the case. And the wonderful thing about history is people know what happened, but everyone can have their own interpretation of what happened and sort of why. And I think that's the role of the historian, is to question why and try and offer a perspective on that. And this book, Firestorm, offers a fantastic perspective on why Dresden was bombed and sort of why we think the way we do today about Dresden. Really enjoyable, and if you haven't had the chance to read it, I'd recommend that you grab a copy, be it from the local library or Amazon or any other good book retailer. Get yourself a copy, have a read. If you've read this book, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What are your thoughts on this book if you've read it? What's your thoughts on Dresden, the bombing war itself? If you agree or disagree, let me know in the comments below. It's always good to have a discussion, open it up. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and we'll catch you next time.